Kia ora koutou everyone, Bula Banaka. My name is Kareem Dickey and I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Council. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Simon from the Embassy of Cuba and the Honourable Graham Kelly as well, former New Zealand High Commissioner with non-resident accreditations to Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. It is a real pleasure to partner today with the Institute of Small and Microstates at Victoria University of Wellington for this panel discussion. Caribbean and Pacific Island states share many of the same challenges, from creating an internationally competitive commercial environment to responding to the threats of climate change. Providing a platform for discussion and the exchange of ideas between regions has been a focus for the Council, and I hope that today's collaboration will be the first of many. Today's chair will be Professor Alberto Costi. He's the international law specialist here at Victoria University with a long-standing interest in the Pacific. His current research project is on the legal status of small island states in international law. So I'll now hand over to Professor Costi to introduce our distinguished panel today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa, tarufa lava and warm Pacific greetings. It is really a pleasure for me to be chairing this panel today. The title that you have seen from the flyer is From the Caribbean to the Pacific Islands, Dreams and Common Issues. And we have the chance today to have three specialists in their own right that deal with issues that are all of importance to small states. And it is also interesting because they bring to the table expertise through the spectrum of issues of importance to all small states, not only Pacific nations, Caribbean nations. And that is, I think, what is the rich element of this panel today. So let me first introduce Dr. Nicole Pearce. She's from the Montfort University in Leicester, in England, and she's the Deputy Director of the Institute of Small and Microstates. She is an expert in law reform and implementation regarding the Caribbean region, and with particular focus on harmonization of commercial laws. This is really an area of great interest at the moment. Then she will be followed by my colleague, Associate Professor Catherine Irons, who is one of our main specialists in this country on mitigation and adaptation in regard to climate change. Cathy is a reader in the law school, and she deals with the issues of environmental law, indigenous rights, statutory interpretation, and she's also a member of one of the committees of the International Law Association, a committee on implementation of rights and indigenous peoples, and a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. She has great expertise in many of these fields, and she'll be speaking second. And then third will be Anna Tuiketi, sorry for pronunciation, who is a barrister in Suva and Deputy Director of the ISMS. She has worked as a consultant to the Asian Development Bank on projects that relate to the Pacific Island states, and she's currently the General Secretary for the Fiji Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She serves as a Vice President for the Fiji Women Lawyers Association, and she has great expertise in some important issues in the region. So what the program will be today is that they will each of our experts is going to make a short statement, about 5-6 minutes each, and then I will open up the discussion with a couple of questions, and then hopefully we'll get some reaction and some discussion from the members of the audience. So without further delay, I will ask Nicole to be our first speaker.
First of all, I'm very pleased to be here, and it's great to be able to talk about an area that I'm very passionate about, which is commercial law reform, especially in the Commonwealth Caribbean region. I am an attorney from Jamaica originally, and now in the UK, and the focus of my research is on modernization and harmonization of areas of commercial law in the region, because what is critical is for member states to individually modernize their laws, especially areas of commercial law, because it impacts on availability and types of credit that becomes available in the country, both domestically and within the region and internationally. And also the ability to harmonize with each other on a regional level, which is absent at this point in time. And I did a rather detailed focus on areas of commercial law, especially insolvency law, because it ties into a number of other key areas of commercial law, company law, credit, debentures, type of negotiable instruments that can become available. And I found in my study that we have countries that will individually modernize their laws by copying from each other, from a single source of law. And in my study, it was Barbados that copied Canada's law because they could no longer copy the UK law because the UK is part of the EU. And Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines copied Barbados, which is fantastic. The problem is that upon implementation, because there was no harmonizing effort between the countries, there was divergence on key provisions of the insolvency law. And this has a great impact on the law, insolvency regime within the region. You also have the other countries that are looking to copy the primary dominant legislation in the region, which is coming out of Jamaica. And Jamaica had one of the major divergences in the insolvency law, which goes against the UNCITRAL model on insolvency law in some of the provisions. So this is going to have an impact not only in the region, but beyond the borders of our region to South America and North America and beyond. And this is of grave concern for us. And so what I did was I looked at how can we fix this? And you had to identify how did it happen in the first place, and that is a dysfunctional relationship that exists on the regional level between the member countries and CARICOM. CARICOM has the ability to create community law and to harmonize laws if it is covered in the treaty itself or by a heads of government decision. It does not have the power to create community law beyond that. And it's very similar to the PIF or the ASEAN structure. And this is very common in regions where you have a lot of former colonies. It's an issue of sovereignty. And ironically, it is the pursuit of intergovernmentalism as a mode of regional governance over supranationalism that actually cost these countries in the long run in relationships with international donors like the IMF, where issues of sovereignty slide to the wayside when you are having balance of payments problems. So I looked at the issue that we encountered in the region, and I developed a way of trying to solve it by a voluntary arrangement through another organization where we could harmonize the law back and at the same time create indigenous model law that's transplantable to the other islands. This has been picked up by the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it is currently before the World Bank for funding. So, yeah. All right.
Thank you very much. It seems very interesting, and we're looking forward to maybe hear a little bit more as we go through some of the questions.
Yeah.
Kathy?
Yes, that's a fascinating one. So I've been out, so Nicole's talked about it much more, like specific examples. I've been out, I'm with all of my, I guess, environmental law hat on, I've been asked to give a much more general, overview type look, and especially comparisons at environmental issues in Pacific and Caribbean. And there are lots of similarities, and I mean, I hope some of them don't seem obvious. Some of you they're obvious when you point them out, but sometimes you don't think of them beforehand. So I thought I did want to just list a few, and hope you don't think I'm being too basic, especially for those who are specialists in the area. But the first thing to note is, so they call themselves often not just small island states in the Pacific and the Caribbean, but these big ocean states. All right, so you often have very small land, very small population, but still with a huge territory when you include the exclusive economic zone to administer, and a lot of resources, and a lot of international interest in their resources. So these big ocean states, when I say environmental issues, I'm talking about management of your resources sustainably, as well as then dealing with the environmental adverse impacts that might arise, whether from your management or someone else's. So you've got things coming at both levels. You've got domestic management of your own, say, laws about fishing, your own laws about waste, maybe your own laws if you want to do deep seabed mining in your economic zone. You've got a lot of, your own land management, quite apart from then things like adapting to climate change, which is maybe adapting to other people's issues. So if you look at capacity, and that's really the one thing that we don't really think about in the larger countries, we might have hundreds of people just in our Ministry for the Environment, right? And we might have, when you come to drafting laws, which is one of the sort of the topics for looking at, we might have people in lots of different departments, say one in fisheries, one or two in Ministry for the Environment, some in DOC, you have different departments around. And we have the Parliamentary Council Office, right, with a lot of people, and they can have a few that specialise, and they can all get together and talk about how you need to draft your laws. There might be one person on a Pacific Island who covers all of the environmental drafting in all the departments. And they might be in the Attorney General's Office and the Ministry of Justice and the Parliamentary Council. They're covering all of these issues. That's really hard if you then also think about, realistically, they've also probably got extended family to cover and a different cultural expectation, about your jobs. Things like that, which we currently have. So it's really hard for capacity when you look at environmental issues to expect either Pacific or Caribbean islands to be dealing with the huge mass of topics that have been coming up, both their own management and then if you look at international law, at the moment I can't even keep up with the climate change negotiations, and that's sort of my job, right, to be watching and keeping up. But so you've got to deal with the latest science on climate change, the technology to deal with it, countries' capacities for what they need to be doing, the capabilities, and the politics around the globe, right? All the politics, to then be able to think about what do we want our negotiating position, what do we want out of a draft agreement, what do we want out of the rule book that's coming under that, and all those requirements to implement these framework international laws. So you've got to have this handle on that, and at the same time, there's the biodiversity negotiations going on right now. We've got beyond biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and all of which the Pacific and the Caribbean states have a big interest in, because that generally deals with biodiversity in the territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, territorial sea, but then also up to the wider exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. That's all, and then sometimes in the high seas, right, so beyond national jurisdiction is the only areas pretty much beyond national jurisdiction that people are looking at is Antarctica. There's the high seas around all of your territories, right, and airspace and things. So basically the high seas is the focus of a lot of the attention which all the small states are interested in, on top at the same time as climate change, at the same time as we're trying to deal with plastic pollution at an international level. And here's one of those lovely added similarities. Both the Pacific and the Caribbean have a beautiful garbage patch floating. It's kilometres wide with tons of plastic waste that's not from their countries, right? It's been collected by ocean currents and it just happens to sit in their territory or around their areas. So they've got to deal with that internationally as well as sort of regionally, and all sorts of other international crises going on, from sort of proliferation of nuclear weapons and geopolitics, the forever chemicals, the nanoplastics, all of those being found in fish and the sea worldwide. Then you get the deep seabed mining, and where are they going to get their frameworks for regulation from while they're trying to figure out what they should do on all the other ones at the same time. So, and issues about clean food and water are looming really large over the Pacific and the Caribbean futures, along with the very existence of the islands themselves in both countries due to sea level rise. Typically none of these problems are of their own doing. They're the unfortunate effects of a wider global population increase and ecological footprint. It's generally the global north and west who are using more and more of the Earth's resources while not being responsible for the waste or the consequences of that use. So that's hitting hard both on the Pacific and the Caribbean, or all small states, but particularly small island states, because of so much effects on the oceans at the moment. I don't need to talk about the geopolitics and things, but there's lots of others because I think it's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing. I don't want to leave it as all doom and gloom. I know as an environmental lawyer, I get doom and gloom across my desk every day, and I can imagine and that's in a large state that doesn't then have to worry about how they're going to have the capacity to deal with it, right? There are many positive signs, and it's the small island states in particular around the globe who dragged the larger ones to agree to aim for 1.5 instead of 2 degrees. So we've got really forward-thinking and, I guess, strong politics and negotiation on the climate level. They've led the world in some of their regional agreements. I'm thinking of the Sargasso Sea Agreement, right, in the Caribbean. It's world-leading in the protection of migratory species. Right? The Pacific has led in what it's tried to do in some of its fishing regional agreements. There's been difficulties with implementation, but no, they've certainly been leading in what they've tried to do, and other regional agreements have been trying to follow. And if there's one thing that I think is really perhaps most interesting, which I'll finish on, is I know we've always had this idea that islands are where you go tropo, right? And there's all this alternative lifestyle, but there's an increasing proportion of the global community is saying that we need to focus less on greed, right, more on community, because we're killing the planet for profit. Right? So if we focus more on these extended family, living in harmony with nature, more than enslaving it, more critical approaches not just to law but to values and ideologies, and then we find that we turn around and then people idolise these island communities that we're also destroying as we touch them, right, or not touch them, as the case may be. So I think that might be another way that these small island states could actually lead the world. Can we have a green, ecologically sustainable tourism where the community benefits, not just hotel chains that are owned from somewhere else? Maybe they can. I don't want to say that this is idolising, that Indigenous peoples are going to save the world. That's really unfair. But I think it's an interesting thought as to another way we could look at the values and the examples. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And now we'll have Anna will be showing us a little extract.
Sorry, well, Petra's Bulavinaka, everybody. I practice in Fiji and around the Pacific. I just wanted to just generally show you, this is just a promotional video that's private sector driven, but promoted by Investment Fiji, but just a different look in the Pacific, specifically Fiji, because when you think, as Kathy's already mentioned, sometimes when you think Fiji, you think Pacific or the Caribbean, we just think holiday destination and these poor, vulnerable societies, etc., etc. But I just wanted to just show you something different. It's halfway through, but because of time constraints, we're just jumping to the main. So that's the promotion that our country normally puts out with investment in Fiji when it comes to private sector. one of the interesting features is that in Fiji, one thing I discovered in the world, the median age right now is 29. In Fiji, it's 27. So we've got a young population. More than 70% of our population is 40 and less. So as you're seeing, our economy is developing. There's been in the Pacific region, if you look at it, we're one of the highest numbers of NCDs. Our life expectancy is quite low. We've got environmental challenges. One thing that's also interesting is that when it comes to trade and the business sector, there's a lot of growth in the SME, micro, small, and medium businesses that are going on. One thing that's also seen right now that's also cropping up in a lot of Pacific countries is women entering businesses. Private sector, because sometimes it doesn't pay for the bill, working in public sector, so they've got to do other means. Trade when it comes to food, customary products. There's a lot of programs, especially with youth and sports. One thing that's also that Fiji, Samoa, Papua New Guinea try and export in terms of its labor market is our English-speaking population, as that can be marketed around the world. And New Zealand and Australia have come into the seasonal workers scheme that they are doing with Tonga, Samoa, and Fiji. So that's been ongoing when it comes to trade. As for climate change, we've had about 2 or 3 countries, Kiribati, Tuvalu, that have been experiencing their islands sinking, so their land sinking. Fiji was the head of COP23. As you all know, our Prime Minister is one of the environmental champions. Vanuatu was one of the first countries in the world to eradicate plastic right throughout. Fiji is entering that as of January 2020. One thing that Fiji is also trying to see is explore, like all other Pacific countries, explore the notion of cooperation and collaboration. So that's where the Pacific is heading to. Last week, my colleague and I, who's at the back, that's Josh from the Fiji Embassy here, we had just come back from Indonesia hosting the Pacific Exposition 2019. There were over 300 delegates, about 19 countries around the Pacific. What was interesting is that Indonesia is coming towards a Southeast Asia and Pacific relationship, giving the Pacific an option outside China or Singapore. As we all know, when it comes to legislation and arbitration and mediation, Singapore likes to champion itself as one of the best in the world. And countries like Samoa, PNG, I keep saying all these other countries because most of the smaller Pacific Island countries follow suit to what laws that we bring in. They have given options to Fiji that say, look, if Singapore is the hub in Asia, they've created demands. There's no natural resources there. They get products from Malaysia and they trade. They almost act like a middleman. Why don't you use Indonesia, Jakarta, as another option to bring the market prices down, as another option to say, look, we're quite similar in terms of tourism. We can do a regional approach when it comes to trade. What they had presented was that there's about 300 million people every year that come in for tourism in the Pacific. So they say, Bali's got similar features. We've got the same weather. We've got the same culture, cultural things. Even Papua New Guinea and Indonesia have similar culture aspects. So that was interesting with last week when it came to trade. Did they touch on the environment last week? Interesting enough, we just covered a bit of the environment where it came to plastic-free product. What are the options that Indonesia is doing when they are supplying disposable plastics that disappear when you wash them in water? That was quite interesting, seeing the developments that they've done with their natural resources. Another interesting thing that was coming out of last week's trade show was using culture and using art as a way of contributing back to the GDP. So they had done their studies, and with the Pacific and with the Caribbean, we've always presented the way that we were, and we've always celebrated culture. We had a beautiful Maori welcome from one of the many Maori families that were here. But one thing that came out was, we have to have cultural heritage protected. But how do we make it sustainable, just like the environmental issues that we are facing? Because culture is also eroding. Even Fiji, I was living in the UK for a year and a half came back, one thing that was interesting about the Fijian communities in the UK is that some of them didn't even know the languages, the native tongue that we had. And how do we sustain that? How do we sustain it by using our culture and our arts, having it as a form of exchange when it came to trade, but having it separate from trade. So what Indonesia had done was they separate arts and culture and having it as its own ecosystem. And then having it as a separate contribution to GDP, but showcasing it and still trying to make it susceptible to what are the challenges that we're facing. I think what I'm trying to present here when it comes to dreams and common issues is where I come from. I'm trying to study systems. A system that is not a one-size-fits-all, but a system that actually works for small island countries that have issues of vast ocean that separate them. We had a presenter from Niue and Tuvalu who said, you know, it's very easy for the Pacific and for Asia to come in and say, you know, we'll contribute together or we'll collaborate with tourism. What they said was, our islands are so far apart, even for a local to go from one island to another, the cost of transport is so high that it's not even worth it. Most Pacific countries, in order to travel to them, it's more cheaper for us in Fiji to travel to the US than to travel around the Pacific. Because we've either got to go through Nadi, which is in Suva, or go through Australia or New Zealand in order to reach them. So what they're saying is that we're happy, you know, that the Pacific is trying to look at a regional approach. But do you think it's fair that some smaller or microstates are left out in the regional approach because of the cost issue? Some of the environmental programs that are being rolled out by experts. We were even having a discussion last week with regards to donor agencies. You know, donor agencies hire experts, you know, and sometimes people like us, we go and we recommend things in other countries. And what the people from the Pacific are saying is, do they even listen to us to consider our living environment that fits into this concept that they're trying to bring in? And I think for us in Fiji and other small countries, when it comes to the issue of arbitration, you know, they, ADB had rolled out the new laws, and there were some criticisms, and there were some advantages that were being brought in. But what some of the legal practitioners in the region were saying, is it good to promote one or the other, or should it be a collaborative system where it works for all? And Professor Petra and I were talking about it last night as well, and it was interesting, is that in the Pacific, we've always relied on barter system. All this negotiation and mediation was always part of our culture. You know, someone in the small community would disappoint somebody else, or someone would steal food or something. So you'd sit down as a family, you'd negotiate terms and conditions, you'd negotiate punishment, you'd negotiate things like that. But now, when it comes to commercial trade and the environment, the negotiation is so serious, it's so quite high level, that for a small country to even mention something, you know, it's almost like a spotlight being put on a shy country, and they feel that, oh, we're too small, what little carbon footprint can I make in a global scale? When now what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, yeah, because your vote is one vote as much as the bigger countries vote. So empowering through cooperation and through collaboration is, I think, one of the systems that we're trying to navigate. The how, the when, and the where, that's, I think it'll develop along the way. Why? Because we've also got technology as an issue. Young people communicate differently, you know. When you have, I lecture at the university, I've got to make sure that I have pictures, I make sure that they're involved, otherwise they're switched off. You know, having deep, reasonable, deep thought, thinking, provoking conversation is not the way to go anymore. You've got to do videos. You've actually got to make sure that their interest is there. The English that we used to learn before is not English anymore. You know, it's either shortcut or emojis that are going on. So trying to make collaboration and cooperation relatable to a young population that's also educated, mind you. The internet has no boundaries or no geographical barriers. So even when we talk, they can Google it after, they'll go on their social media platform and give their opinion if they choose to. So those are challenges in terms of trying to navigate through trade, through climate change, and trying to make the solutions very practical so that the Pacific Islanders actually own it. They actually are proud of it. But one thing that I discovered last week is that one of the options or one of the solutions is to use culture or patriotism to actually bring back a system that they could all own it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that these three opening statements have been incredibly important. I think that what Nicole, when you talk about harmonization, it's quite important for these states in a region to work together. At the same time, I guess the problem is always one: where do you draw the line between having measures imposed from outside and those, and where you have the capacity to create your own system with the limits of the capacity and resources, as Kathy was saying. I think that is always one of the challenges, and probably it's a different problem in the Caribbean. And I think it's also important that the problems are slightly different from one region to another. It's not only one set of small states, and probably some of the issues of capacity are different in the Caribbean than they are in the Pacific, where there is the need. But I think in both cases, the need for model laws are quite important. And I think, coming out from the three presentations, I think there are some words that ring a bell, like empowerment and also owning the process. I think for small states, it is important to be part of the process, not a top to bottom, but bottom up approach. And then issues, I think, of resilience, empowerment. And I think that the work that the three of you do is really fascinating. And I have a few questions, maybe to get the conversation going a little bit further. And maybe I'll ask, and I'll start with Nicole. What is the influence of, obviously, these regions have their interests, their dreams, as we put in the title, but what is the influence of larger countries on some of the individual countries, for instance, or the influence, for instance, of China on some of these smaller states, or influence of donors? How do that impact the capacity of these smaller states?
Well, that's two different aspects to the question. The first, in relation to, if you look at the region, the Caribbean region are small former colonies that have very similar comparative advantages with each other. And when we became independent, we became fiercely competitive with each other over the same market. And today, we are still highly competitive, which is what impacts on our ability to operate at a regional level. We are 50-odd years independent, and it is very important for us to recognize the rights of these countries to want to operate in an intergovernmental approach towards regional integration. And we will eventually get there, but to compare us to the EU is just not feasible. How the EU came about and how CARICOM came about, two different histories. And the need to respect the country's desire to continue with intergovernmentalism must be recognized, primary, foremost, if you're going to formulate anything for that region. In relation to externalities such as China, China is a very interesting player in the Caribbean right now, because one of the things that they're coming into the region is they are coming in to compete with international donors against the World Bank. They're coming in to fund infrastructure works and projects, and they will own those projects on a buyout over a number of years. And so they're very much in the countries in the region, but it's multifaceted. Number one, they're coming in with money. They are using the common law legal system to retain and to cement their rights under contract law in these countries. They are seeking and getting concessions from the governments in relations to not only taxes and the materials that they bring in, they also are able to bring in labor, not just skilled labor, but we're talking manual laborers. They bring in their own labor. So there's a distortion that's happening. Even though we may have a boom in construction, we're not necessarily, meaning our workers are not necessarily benefiting from that. On top of that, they're also staying. in these countries. So there's going to be a change in our demographics in the next, 10, 20 years. From that standpoint, we don't even know what that's going to look like. From the international donor standpoint, let's look at the IMF. The IMF has a mandate with each individual member country. It cannot look from a regional standpoint, whereas the World Bank operates on a similar capacity, but it has a more forward-thinking approach towards the region. And that's why we found them to be a great partner to work with. Part of the problem with the Bretton Woods institutions is that they have the money, but they don't have the country support. You have voluntary organizations such as the Commonwealth Secretariat, which has a great brand and a great image in our region, that has the country support, but unfortunately doesn't have the money. So it's a natural marriage taking place, which seems to be working so far, where you will have the World Bank funding it, but the Commonwealth Secretariat will be the implementing arm. What's beautiful about these projects that are coming out is that they are regionally driven. It's, as you said, bottom-up approach, okay? And the countries are buying into it because it's using regional specialists who understand the laws. And it is the creation of these model laws that are a fusion from these different dichotomies that have taken place in that same area of law. And it's more adaptable. So the countries are more receptive to it. It is very hard for a country when you're competing on the World Bank doing business report indices, okay, and you're ranking, and you're forced to undertake these legislative reforms that may not have a good fit for you. And that's one of the major problems that we have.
Thank you very much. Kathy, do you want to say a few words as well on the influence of China or other superpowers in the region?
I could, but I'll be honest, I think that there's been so much. I think Fiji's got such an excellent example of Chinese influence lately, and that illustrates the exact parallel that I wonder if Anna might be a better person to comment on that one, but I've got a lot to comment on the law reform question maybe.
Okay, so I'll come back.
Yeah.
You'll speak first on the law reform.
Yeah, so why don't, there's lots I can say on vote buying and international law, and obviously they're doing it at an international level. International states are trying to pick off through aid these other small states one by one and say, hey, you vote with me effectively on whether it's whaling or it's climate change. That kind of, we know that's happening, and they happen with all the environmental issues that are relevant to resources particularly. And I guess it's increasing in the Pacific. Maybe the one thing I can say is the one thing that has, galvanized against that is when they become a region, when they act like a region, or when you get more than a region, you get something like AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, that together it's not just any particular region, but all the small island states from around the world, and suddenly they have power. And so if we can find a way to get more ways to get these states together to negotiate common positions for maybe to countering vote buying, or to just further their interests. It could be to see anyone, but that could be something that would be much more helpful. So I'll pass it to you.
My observation in terms of the Chinese influence in the Pacific, it's always been there, but in the last couple of years it's accelerated. And what's interesting is that the industry that it's accelerated in is construction, mining, and tourism. So what they do is that they fund the project in the name of upgrading or development. But I don't know if some of you had seen, there was a New Zealand Kiwi reporter that came to Fiji about a couple of months ago who reported on the devastation of what this Chinese investor was doing to the marine life. And it was on native land. And what was interesting is that when she filmed, and I saw it myself, when she filmed, the landowners were almost as if they were strangers to their own land. Because the Chinese had, this particular Chinese investor had not only cordoned off, had further developed the land, killed all the corals and the marine resources, tried to make a Bora Bora kind of design on this land, but did not even have environmental impact assessment report going on, didn't have the proper approvals. And what was also interesting, that it found itself in the High Court 2 months ago, and the High Court had given a stop order for them to stop developing. Now, mind you, they've already put in millions. What the reporter had also documented was that at night, the development and the construction would accelerate, and during the day it would slow down. I mean, if you have a chance, please look at it's on YouTube as well. And what was interesting was that the stop order from the High Court, the judge had said, for that Chinese investor, not only to pay back, but to put back the environment the way it was before they actually came on. Now, how you do that physically, that would be an interesting follow-up to see. I mean, you've killed and wrecked the land, you've tried to put in reform on it, and you've further developed it. So that's interesting. One thing that I've also observed, because I'm with the Fiji Chamber of Commerce, is that the increase in the Asian players, to the point where the Fijian market also are looking at other options apart from China. So Indonesia has pumped in construction companies, but using Fiji as a base. They're now building one of the largest stadium in Kiribati, but where the base of the Indonesian company is Fiji. I mean, the environmental issues are there, but they'll build the stadium for the sake of development. There's also funding in education, where one of our schools, the older schools, Queen Victoria, that's a $6 million project that they're still negotiating the details of what to do. Funding in education, where they open up security and defense, where there's an exchange of personnel, or masters in Indonesia, Malaysia. Malaysia has also entered in. About 2 weeks ago, we had the Malaysian Trade Exposition in Fiji, where they had the business to business. With negotiation on tax and customs. So what's interesting now that I see that Fiji and Samoa and Papua New Guinea are heading towards is looking at other options apart from China. One thing that I also see when it's policy level with Fiji, on a global scale, they will want to see what China's up to. But on a regional scale, they want to see other options when it comes to lowering costs in trade, shipping, construction options. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you very much. Well, Kathy, why don't you tell us a little bit more about law reforms, law and custom, because you've got quite a bit of expertise in that area.
So I already mentioned this difficulty in capacity in law reform, and so but one of the issues has been the influence of outsiders on law reform. So there's something that the Centre for Small States has run, or the Institute rather, and we've run 2 seminars on law and environment in small states, and we've actually focused on drafting, and we've had a couple of speakers, including Dara Modeste, who's from the Caribbean, who's talked about her experience in drafting, and also a UK drafter who's basically spent most of his career drafting on contract for small states, and mostly in the Caribbean. But it's a fascinating, and I've also done, I guess I've had some input into the deep seabed mining legislation in the Cook Islands. And so I thought what they all illustrate is one, that the lack of capacity has meant, certainly in these modern topics, and take deep-seated mining as an example, but even the environmental ones, sometimes consultant drafters have been employed, and they have simply taken model legislation such as from New Zealand, or you mentioned the Canada example, and they've just imported it. And often these consultants are lawyers in other, Western common law countries, right, who aren't used to dealing with, say, customary law and their impact, and maybe the wider legal system there. And it has caused issues, they say, in the drafting and then the passage of the legislation, and that disconnect between what people see written down and what they just assume they're going to do in practice anyway. So there's a difference there with the way we might see our legislation, our statutory interpretation, and the binding nature of some of the words, right? And when you interpret words, what are you going to do? What did you expect when you were implementing those anyway? And sometimes they're slightly different. But as an example for the deep seabed mining legislation, we had the EU, which has funded the development of a draft regional framework All right, here's some model suggestions for deep seabed mining. So part of it has been driven by the EU because, and now this is only hearsay, I don't know this for a fact, but the suggestion has been because the EU want to do some of the mining. The EU, some of the companies are based in the EU and they want to be doing some of the mining. So they want to get a good certain national framework of laws up. But the EU is also concerned about environmental standards as well. So it's not all money. They want to get a reasonable framework up and make sure it's not just left to, a rogue state that's not maybe governed by some of the international standards. So that's important, but the states in the Pacific don't have to adopt this regional framework. It's just a suggestion, it's just a model, and we've had difficulty with the Cook Islands in drafting its legislation. They had assistance from the New Zealand Parliamentary Council Office, which was very helpful, but I guess maybe the lack of expertise, but they haven't had, say, international law expertise in as to what the statement of, say, the precautionary principle should be, or what the statement on the law of the sea should be, and they've got people who are domestic experts in EEZ legislation, in the New Zealand EEZ legislation, and it's a bit different. So there have been, certainly there were many holes, and the locals, there was a lot of local opposition to it, at the same time as a lot of local support for it because of the likely income, and they've had a real tension. And that drafting has been really hard, and that's despite the fact that they've already got what they say is the largest marine reserve in the Pacific around, taking up most of the EEZ. It's not officially given, but as such in the domestic legislation. So you've had a lot of difficulties, and mainly around capacity, but also I guess these foreign interests putting their finger in. But maybe this is one where they could have helped a bit more. Just an illustration, but you could say that for any area of law, not just the one I gave.
Do you want to add something briefly?
Yes, I did. I wanted to add on to what you were saying, and I wanted to caution when small nation states look for other sources of funders, for example, beyond China. I'm going to give you an example in relation to Russia. Russia heavily invested in and bought out the bauxite mines in Jamaica and into South America, and a number of years ago. And this turned out to, on the one hand, be a blessing because it took that off the government, the debt off the government for the mines. But the other issue was that you found that bauxite production, and for those of you that don't understand, bauxite is one of the major components in making of aluminum that are used in, for example, cars or tins, that type of thing. And you found that bauxite production was being manipulated, for lack of another word, in Russia. So this has an impact on the bauxite that's being mined and shipped out, which has an effect on our balance of payments as a country. So there was a manipulation or a slowdown in production of bauxite, which forced up the price for bauxite internationally. And that was good for them, but not necessarily good for us, okay? Because it slowed down productions and the workforce got laid off on the mines. So you have to be very careful when you're looking for options for funding or investment for your country, because it comes it comes as a double-edged sword.
Running
Yes,
out of time. So I will invite. I would like first of all to thank our three speakers for a very interesting event, and I will ask Petra Butler, Dr. Butler, to make a vote of thanks.
Well, yeah. Thank you all for coming. I not only would like to thank our speakers and Alberta's sharing, but I also thank the audience for coming and asking questions and being part of this event. I'm the, other than being a professor here at the law school, I'm the director of the Institute for Small and Micro States, which has come out of the Center for Small States. So in one sense, we're running these events for the last 4 years. And we're actually independent. So we're an independent research institute with the aim to knowledge dissemination, provide a platform for bringing experts together, giving voice to small states. Because just to reiterate a point which was made by our panelists, is actually if small states would coordinate and band together, they would have a larger voice in the UN than the EU. Yeah, 20% of all UN states are actually small states. So we try to do this. So we're independent, do not be bound, but restricted, to provide this research platform. We will try to do this more in New Zealand. And can I just say, and this is why you're basically special and celebratory, since this morning, we do have an MOU with Victoria University, will help to get the centre running. We have more or less one with USP, and we have a partnership agreement with the University of the West Indies, and we're looking at signing one, very close of signing, it's negotiated, it's just waiting the signature with the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London. And we build on that. We're looking at Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and then actually some African small states, because there are also about 14 small states in Africa with the definition as under 1.5 million inhabitants. So yeah, so welcome. Thank you for being part of the celebration of ISMS in New Zealand, and we're looking forward to seeing you at more events. Thank you.
Thank you.